In part 1 of this series, we'll be putting together the server side of our application. And to do that, we'll be using Launchpad to actually manage our GraphQL backend and just handle the Express application and make things very easy for us to get started and allow us to do everything in the browser. Again, to easily handle the backend, we're going to be using a hosted MongoDB provider. And in this case, I'll be using MLab because they have a great free Sandbox environment that we can set up easily, quickly, and just use that here. When you go to launchpad.graphql.com, you'll go to a new actual Launchpad that you can set up. And you can see yours should look very similar to this. This is just the default of what Launchpad is going to give you. Just to clean things up, I'm going to delete some of these comments here. And I'm also going to add a new object here, and I'm going to call that temp_user. And inside of there, we're just going to keep a temporary user document so that before we actually have our database connection, we can actually start seeing results of our query. So that's just going to have an ID, and we'll just set that to a string of 1. And it'll also have an email, and I'll set that to my email of spencer@handlebarlabs.com. And if we go ahead and give this a quick test, you can see we've already defined this hello query. Let's just make sure it actually works correctly, and you can see it does return the correct data. Next thing we want to do is set up a query to actually get the current user. So first thing we'll do is actually add that to our type definition, and I'm just going to go ahead and delete the hello one just because we don't need that. So that's going to be current user, and then that's going to return a type of user, which we now need to define. So we'll go up here in our type defs and we'll say type user. And if we look up at our temp user, we can see that we expect to return an ID, which is a string. Then we'll also return an email, which is also going to be a string. Now we'll actually set up the resolver for this query. Again, we'll delete the hello one because we don't need it. And we can say current user. And then we'll just set up a function to go ahead and then return our temp user, which we set up. So with this completed, let's go ahead and try out our current user query instead, and then we'll specify that we just want to get the ID and the email back in our response. Now, given that we're setting up authentication, we're going to set up 2 mutations as well, one for logging in and one for actually signing up as a new user. So we'll add those to our type definitions. We'll say type mutation, and we're going to have a login mutation. And that login mutation is going to take 2 arguments, the first one being an email. That's going to be a required string. And the second argument is going to be password, and that's also going to take a required argument of string. And then finally, this mutation can return a user. Signup is going to be nearly the exact same thing. Only difference here is that we're calling a different mutation. We can now go ahead and actually set up our resolvers for this mutation, which we'll add in our resolvers object. So we'll say mutation, and inside of there we'll set up login, and that's just going to be a function, which again we will just return the temp user. Signup is going to be the same thing. We'll just change the key of that. Now, one thing we do want to do is actually make sure we're getting the email and password that we need, and that's going to be coming in through the args argument within our mutation. So the first thing is going to be root, and then we're going to have args, or the arguments of whatever the client is passing to our GraphQL server. And something we can do here just to make it a little bit easier on ourselves is actually use object destructuring. So instead of passing args and then we have to say args.email, args.password, we can then just go ahead, destructure that object, and then we can just access email and password directly. I've just gone ahead and added a console.log just so we can check. If we open up the logs here, we can go ahead and when we call this mutation, first we'll go ahead and define it. We'll say mutation login. We'll pass my email address in here, and that's going to be spencer@handlebarlabs.com. Make sure you use double quotes here instead of single quotes. And we'll also pass the password, which doesn't matter, we're not actually accessing anything, but we'll just say password, and then we expect to get an ID and an email as a response. So we can go ahead and try that. And you can see indeed that we do, and if we look down here in the logs, we can see that data of spencer@handlebarlabs.com and password was passed. So when we use that data, it is available to us. Once you've gone through the quick process of actually creating your MLab account, which will just take you a few minutes, you can go ahead and create a new Sandbox database, which I've already gone ahead and done. You can then go ahead, choose it from their dashboard, or choose that deployment, and at the top you'll see this to connect via a driver via the standard MongoDB URI. You'll see this URI down here, and you want to go ahead and copy that. And before you actually do that, what you want to do is on the Users tab, just go ahead and create a database user so that we can actually access that. And that username and password you set up at this point is what we'll put in place here for the DB user and DB password. So taking this URL back to Launchpad, if we go down here where we've got secrets, you can go ahead, click that, and then for the key you want to set Mongo_URL. I'm doing all caps here, that's just kind of a convention I follow. You can do whatever you want, just make sure you remember that. And then for the value, I'm going to paste that string in that I got before. Now for this DB user and DB password, make sure to replace that with whatever the values you actually set up for your database instance are. With that completed, we actually want to make our database connection, and we'll be using the MongoDB npm package to do that. And what I'm going to do is from MongoDB, I'm going to import Mongo client, which is coming from MongoDB. And to actually make this database connection, we're going to go down to the bottom of our file at our context function. And what this context function is doing is actually allowing us to, from this function, we can specify our header values, which are coming in, our secrets, and we can then go ahead and pass those as the third argument to our queries and our mutations so that we can access them anywhere. This is a good place for us to also pass connection instance of our Mongo database to these different queries and these different mutations. So the first thing I want to do is actually turn this context function into an async function, and all I have to do to enable that is put the async keyword in front of function. And then outside of the function, I'm going to set up a new variable called Mongo, and that way we can store our single database connection between different requests to our GraphQL backend. That way we're not constantly trying to connect to our database. We just kind of store a connection while the server's available. And then inside of the context function, what we want to set up is a simple if statement, and we'll say if Mongo, so currently it's undefined, so if Mongo's undefined, what we want to do is say Mongo is equal to await Mongo client dot connect, and this is where we're going to tap into that secret we added earlier with our Mongo URL, which is available as the second argument to our context function. So I'll just say secrets dot Mongo URL, and we're using the await keyword because the Mongo client dot connect will return a promise, which will halt the rest of this until we get some sort of response back. Now with the database connection set up, we can actually go ahead and start setting up a real signup mutation versus just our kind of simulated one here. And the first thing we need to do to actually do that is make sure we get access to this Mongo variable that we're setting up in context, which we actually need to go ahead and pass to anything that calls that. So all we're going to do is add Mongo to this return object. Now within our signup mutation, we can do the same thing we had in login. We'll say root, we'll access the email and the password. And then the third argument is going to be context, which is just this object that we set up down here. So again, I'm going to use object destructuring, and I'll just access the Mongo instance directly. So then within the actual signup mutation, what we want to do is access whatever the collection that we're actually trying to access is. And in this case, it's going to be users. So I'll store that on a variable, and I'm going to say mongo.collection, and then we specify users. Okay, and something important to note is this is different than where you actually set up users before. This is just a collection within our Mongo database. They're two separate things. So once this is done, we want to check when we're signing up if we already have an existing user with that email address. So I'll say const existing user is equal to users.findOne with an email. Now if you're familiar with Mongo, you'll know that this won't quite work because users.findOne is going to return a promise. So we want to wait for that promise to resolve. So what we can do is actually put that await keyword in, just like we did elsewhere, and we can actually wait for that response. But what we also need to do here is add the async keyword before we actually define the function so that it knows what's going on. Okay, so if someone's calling the signup mutation and there already is an existing user with that email address, we're going to say if existing user, then we're going to throw a new error and we'll just say email already used. Okay, and if there isn't already an existing user, then we can go ahead and save that user. And something we're going to have to do is store the user's password. So to make sure we're not storing the user's password in plain text in our database, which you should never do, we're going to use a package called Bcrypt, which will allow us to actually hash that password. So I'll import Bcrypt from Bcrypt. And then going back down to our signup mutation, what we'll say is const hash is equal to bcrypt dot hash. We'll pass the password, and then we'll pass the number of salts there. I want to make sure I name the variables correctly here. Okay, and with this done, now we can actually go ahead and insert a user into the database. So we'll say await users.insert, and then we want to pass the data we actually want to insert in the database. So we'll pass the email as is, and we'll pass a password, but instead of the actual password, we'll pass that hash in. With that completed, we can then go ahead and actually return this new user from the database. So we'll say const user is equal to users.find1. We'll pass the email as the key we're actually looking for, and then finally, if that user, if we create it, we'll just return that actual new user. Now if I go ahead and actually try this signup mutation, we'll just say mutation signup. We'll pass signup, we'll pass an email in here. We can say spencer@handlebarlabs.com. We'll pass in the password. I'm just going to set this to password. And then again, we'll try and get that ID and the email back instead. I'll go ahead, run this. We can see we get a response back. This ID is not what we're using in the temp user, so that's good. If I go to mlab, I look in my collection, we can see that we do have the email here, but you can see the password's incorrect. And what's happening here is when I'm calling bcrypt.hash, that takes some amount of time, and it's actually returning a promise, but I'm not waiting for that promise to resolve. So what I'm going to do is add the await keyword in front of that. I'll go back to MongoDB or MLab, actually delete that document we just created. And then with this saved, we can actually go ahead and try to run this again. And to do that, we'll just go up here, sign up. We should get a response back. We get our ID, our email. And then if we look inside at our records, you can see we've got the email, we've got the ID, and we've got the password, and that obviously doesn't say password. That's the hashed password that we're getting back from Bcrypt. With signup completed, we can now go ahead and set up the login mutation. I'm going to do the same thing here. We'll access Mongo from context. We'll then delete this console.log and say const users is equal to mongo.collection users. And then again, we want to see if there is an existing user with that email that's being passed in. So we'll say const user is equal to users.find1. We'll use the email as the key we're searching for. And then this time, instead of throwing an error if the user exists already, we'll throw an error if the user does not exist. So if not user, we'll throw a new error and we'll say email not found. So if the user is found, what we want to do is actually check if the past password that the user passed to our backend actually matches what is stored in the database. So what we'll say is const valid password is equal to await bcrypt.compare, and we'll pass the password, which is what was passed from the client, to what we have stored in our database, which is that user.password. And you can see an error showing up here because I'm using the await keyword, but we need to add async before our actual function, so we can use the await keyword. And something else we want to add is before this users.find1, we also want to wait for that promise to resolve before moving on. Okay, back down to our password, we can say if not valid password. So if those passwords do not match, we'll again throw a new error. This time we'll say password is incorrect. Finally, if all of these things pass, if the password is correct, the user exists, we'll then go ahead and actually return the user. And to actually look at this, so we know we set up the Spencer@handlebarlabs.com previously. We'll go ahead and run the login mutation, and we should get a response back here. But if I just say a@handlebarlabs.com, run that login mutation, we can see it says email not found. As a means of identifying the user with something other than their email and password directly, so something that we can pass along with the authorization header with a request with a query or a mutation, we're going to be using Json Web Tokens, or JWTs for short. And this allows us to basically, when the user signs in with their email and password or signs up, the server is going to return, it's going to generate and then return what's called a Json Web Token. And this is a way for us to actually identify the client that, they've signed in with these different pieces of data in the past, and they're authorized to make requests on behalf of a user. So once we generate that JWT, in the future we'll actually go ahead and take that, store it on the client, and then whenever the client, the React Native client we'll build in part 2, makes a request to, for example, our current user query, it will then pass that JWT along in the authorization header, allowing us to actually identify that user correctly. And then using that JWT, we can actually go ahead and find the user based on it and add the user to context. So we can say something like context.user and actually get that user's Mongo record. And a note on that last step is we're going to have to do that relatively manually given that we're using Launchpad, but if you're controlling your Express server in its entirety, there's a package out there called express-jwt, which will kind of automatically add the user to context based on their JWT. But this is a great way for us to kind of learn what's going on behind the scenes in that package. But before we move on, the first thing we need to do is actually add our Jwt secret to our secrets of our application. That's going to be used to actually sign and generate the JWT. It's kind of like the password for that password that allows us to specify, what's actually valid. And it's used as our kind of comparison key. So we want to actually add that to our secrets. So again, along with our Mongo URL, which you've already got there, we'll go ahead and add a JWT_secret. And then I'm just going to make this super secret. Actually use something that is secret in any real applications. And the other thing we want to make sure we do is inside of our types for our user, we also want to return a JWT, which is going to just be a string. So to actually generate these JWTs, the first thing we're going to need to do is actually import JWT from the package called Json Web Token. Alright, then we can scroll down to our actual resolver functions, and the only time we'll want to return a JWT is from the login mutation or the signup mutation. And we'll do the login one first. When that will actually be generated is if the user exists, if they've got the valid password, then we're going to go ahead and create that JWT. So we'll say user.jwt is equal to jwt.sign, and then the first argument to this sign function is the payload you want specified along with the JWT. And what we'll do here is actually pass the database ID of our user's document, and we can use that later on to actually find the user based on it. So what I'll just do here is say _ID is the user._ID. And then the second argument to this is going to be coming from our secrets, which will just be secrets.jwt secret. Okay, and you can see secrets is not defined. That's coming from our context function down here. So we can just go ahead and import that right next to our Mongo variable. So the login mutation should be all good to go. Let's go ahead and demo it. All we need to do is add that to our login mutation, and we can go ahead and run this. And you can see we're now getting this string as an additional response from the endpoint, and that's our JWT, which we can then use later on to actually specify who this user is. Let's go ahead and do the same thing for the signup mutation. When this is going to happen is after we've found the new user document, we'll then just go ahead and say user.jwt is equal to jwt.sign. Again, we'll pass the ID of the document as our payload, and then we'll say secrets.jwt secret. And then we need to make sure we import secrets, which we can do alongside Mongo. And then let's go ahead and give this a shot. So I'll say JWT. We need to change our user. So I'll just say a@handlebarlabs.com. We'll set sign up. And you can see here that we're actually getting null as our response. So if I work back up from sign up, I can assume we've got an object here, which is coming from const users equal to users.find1. But the issue here is we're not actually waiting for that promise to resolve. So we need to actually add that await there. And basically the reason it was working previously was GraphQL and Apollo are just going to actually resolve a promise for us automatically. So we didn't notice that problem previously, but we did here. So let's go ahead, create a new user. This time we'll say b@handlebarlabs.com, and we can run that mutation. And after sign up, you can see we are successfully getting a JWT back in our response. All right, we're just about there. Last thing we want to do is actually, based off of a JWT being passed in the authorization header, we want to add that user to context so we can use it in our queries. And to do that, what we'll be doing is creating a new function, and I'm just going to call this const get user. That's going to be an async function, and it's going to take 3 arguments. The first one's going to be authorization, second one is going to be secrets, and the final one is the Mongo connection. All right, and what I've done here is we're taking those 3 arguments, the most important one being authorization, or authorization header. And on there, if you're familiar with the way it's set up, is you're going to have the word bearer, and then a space, and then whatever that token is. So what we want to do is actually get the length of just kind of the standard stuff, which is just bearer and then a space. So we want to get the length of that, and we're saying if we've got an authorization header, and if the length of that authorization is greater than just kind of the plain bearer space, that means we've probably got what seems to be a valid authorization token. So we want to go through the process of trying to verify it and find the user document if it exists. And then if these aren't true right away, we'll just instantly return null because they're not going to have an authorized user to be added to context. We'll then go ahead and actually grab the token. So we'll say the token is equal to authorization.sliceBearer.length, which is going to give us whatever's left of the string after this bearer space. Okay, so what I'm doing here now is just setting up a new promise because we need to wait for our response here. And then inside of here, we're going to try to verify the token that's passed to us. So we're going to say jwt.verify token, and then we're going to use the secrets.jwt to see if it is a valid token, and this is going to then take a callback with an error and a result. And basically what we will do here is if we've got an error, then we're going to resolve this function, and we're going to say OK is false because there's some error, it's not a valid token, and then as the result we'll pass the error. Otherwise, if there isn't an error, then we can go ahead and say resolve, and we're going to pass OK is true, and we'll also just pass the result as is. And then up here what we're doing is just destructuring this object we're returning, so we've got OK and result as variables available to us. So if the response is OK, meaning the authorization token is correct, we can then go ahead and say const user is equal to await mongo.collection users, and we'll try to find one based off of the ID. Remember, we added that to the payload of this, so what we'll have to do is actually convert the string in it to an object ID. So I'm going to go up to the top of my file, and alongside Mongo client, I'm going to import what's called object ID, which will allow us to just convert that string to an object ID, which Mongo actually uses for IDs. So we can then just say object ID, and we'll pass the result._ID. And then if whatever that response is we get back from the database, we can then go ahead and return user. If the result was not okay, then we're just going to go ahead and return null. We can now go ahead and take this getUser function that we set up previously and add that to our context function to add the user to context if we need it. So after we've made this Mongo connection, we can then say const user is equal to await getUser, and then here what we want to do is actually pass from our headers, we want to pass that authorization token or key on our headers to the getUser function. And we also want to pass our secret so we can access the Jwt Secret and then our Mongo instance as well. And then finally, taking this user, we want to pass that to context so that we can access it elsewhere. And then finally, let's go ahead and update our current user query to actually use the user from context. So what I can do, again, we've got root, we've got args, we're not using either of those, but we are using context. Again, I'll use object destructuring here, and I'll just try to access the user, and I can say return user. Let's go ahead and add that query in here. So we'll say query user, and we'll just access the current user and see what we get back. So we'll just try to get the ID, the email, because that's all we can get. We're not going to generate a JWT, so we won't request that. It would just return null. Now, if I run this query, you'll see all we're getting back is null, and that's because we're not passing that header in. Fortunately, in Launchpad, we can actually do that. We'll just go up to our headers. Actually, first, we'll go ahead, log in as Spencer at Handlebar Labs. I'm going to copy the JWT token we've got here, and going to headers again, we're going to add a new key for authorization, and I'm going to add bearer space, and then I want to put in that token. Now if I try to query it, we'll go to the user query. We can see we do get a current user back because we're passing the header. If we go down to the get user, we're passing the header token. We've got the token after that bearer, and then we're going ahead verifying that token. We're then going ahead and resolving true that it is okay, finding the user if it is. But if I go ahead and actually change the header to something invalid, we'll just change that to A. And then if I go ahead and try to actually query the user, you can see it's returning user because it's an invalid token at that point, even though it's there. And then I think this was an E. If I say change it back, we can go ahead, try to query the user, and we should get a response back. All right, so our backend is all set up, good to go. We've got our database connection. We're actually using JWTs, we're returning them, we're hashing our password. Everything's set up on the back end of our application. In part 2 of this series, we'll actually set up the React Native client to interact with this, store the JWT on the async storage, and everything that goes along with that. So make sure to watch the next video to get all of that information on how to connect to it from the React Native client.